So maybe I'll go ahead and get started by introducing myself. I'm Nancy López, and I am currently Vice President of the Sociologists for Women in Society. And I have had the pleasure of working with Josephine very closely, our president of the Sociologists for Women in Society, and came up with this idea of having a conversation about some of the possibilities and challenges of institutionalizing intersectionality in the neoliberal university. And I reached out, and I was so happy that I had 3 of the people that I have been following, some for decades, but to participate in kicking off our conversation. We really hope that this is going to be an interactive dialogue. So originally the program said 2 hours, but I'm hoping that we can do this in an hour and 15, an hour and 30 minutes, so that we can keep this concise and also actionable. And so just a few things on logistics. I've asked all of the panelists to prepare 7, maybe 10 minutes of comments. And then I've posed several questions for them to think about in their comments, but of course we can pick them up in the Q&A. In the meantime, while our panelists are presenting, feel free to put questions in the chat and be specific about who you want that question to go to, but we will reserve all of those questions until the dialogue portion, which should be a good 30 to 40, maybe even 45 minutes. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panelists, and they will speak in the order that is listed in the program. The first panelist is Michelle Jacob, Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Oregon, and her conversation is going to be about critical race feminist studies and how they need to respect place and our Mother Earth. And the second speaker will be Professor Amanda Lewis, who is at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and she will be talking about a number of things, including how as a white woman, you can become a co-conspirator in anti-racist intersectional feminist practice. And then finally, we'll have comments from Professor Ruth Zambrana, who recently became Distinguished Professor at the University of Maryland, which I'm so elated about. And she's Professor and Chair of Women's Studies at the University of Maryland, also faculty in Sociology. And her conversation will be about intersectionality as an epistemic standpoint, who tells a story in the absence of Chicana and Latina voices. So I will put my little timer for 7 minutes. When you see one hand go up, that basically means that you have, 3 to 4 minutes remaining. And then when I put my 2 hands up, that means that we're at 10 minutes. And again, the purpose is to have remarks that really involve, I see there's 27 people already that have joined, so that we can have an interactive conversation. So I will start by asking Michelle to start us with her comments. Thank you. And I'll ask everyone to mute themselves if you don't mind, if you're not speaking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Barrett and Josephine and everybody who's done so much work to bring us together and to make these wonderful conversations possible. That's really nurturing work, it's critical work, it's healing work. And so I thank you very much. I'm honored to be here with these distinguished panelists. I'll go ahead and introduce myself the way that I was taught by my elders. Sheikh Maitzri Ignash Winiksha Michelle Jacob, Washna Shakama Knik, Kukut Mchash, University of Oregon Pa, Subsequent Education Studies, Goshlan Ishwa Ikuk, Dichampai, Yakama Pam, Iwa Payushich. So good morning, everybody out here out west. I happen to be joining you today from my reservation, the Yakama Reservation. I'm a member of our tribe. And I want to just greet you all. And behind me, I have one of my special sisters, auntie sisters, Wiunu, or Huckleberry. If any of you have had the opportunity to pick, or harvest or enjoy huckleberries, she's a special being. She's sweet, but also tart. She's fierce, will grow and thrive often where no other beings will. And she's a medicine and a food for us. She sustained our people for countless generations since time immemorial, as my elders say. And so as I thought about the panel for today, and what was the message that I wanted to share, it's that I think there's a lot of wisdom, a lot of gifts, a lot of healing that's overlooked. I think that we need to do more of looking at our more than human relations to guide us and to inspire us, to help be our models. And so that's what I basically the gist of what I want to share. Other comments that I think can be good conversation points or common ground for us all is that all of our institutions are on Indigenous homelands. And so we have a responsibility to be in good relationship with the place, with the lands and the waters, and all the beings there, as well as the people, right, on whose Indigenous homeland our institutions are built. I work at the University of Oregon, which is not on my homeland, although my people have always traveled and traded and been in good relation with people of the Willamette Valley. Kalapuya peoples is the place where my institution is built. And so I have that responsibility as well, right? And so we see some beginning steps happening more and more at institutions like land acknowledgements, which are good, right? Those are good beginning points. They let people know who are part of that university or college community where they are, which is important because from an Indigenous perspective, if you don't know where you are, you're lost. And how are you going to be an effective, good teacher, researcher, administrator, student if you're lost? And so that's why land acknowledgements are an important first step, right? They allow people to be aware and to begin to consider what does it mean to be in good relation with this place and the first peoples of this place. But land acknowledgements too often are symbolic gestures that do more, or that do little more than kind of soothe the sort of white fragility, angst that we see so often at our institutions. And so we see important movements like Land Back, which is gaining momentum and raising questions of, you know, who should have to pay to go to our institutions, right? And raising questions about Indigenous and Black students and migrant students and everybody having access to our institutions. And so I think those are important conversations to have, and that we desperately need movement on these issues. And so I think those are kind of the backbone of what I wanted to share today. It's ideas about not only what to do in our institutions, but how to do that. How do we want to be? How do we want to be in relation with place, with all of our relations around us, you know, human and more than human? And as I tell my students, you know, oftentimes in class when we're in person, but also, you know, virtually, say, go outside, find your favorite tree or plant, you know, and just stand there and be in relation with that being. You know, share with them what your thoughts and ideas are today. What's your biggest problem today? And be humble in front of that being. And it really does something, you know, it changes kind of how we are in the world. You know, as academics, we're so often just, you know, in our heads, doing the critique, doing the analysis, and that's good. But we can do more. And this organization has long understood that, right? That need to care and to nurture ourselves and each other as part of our academic work. And so that's, those are the things that I'm thinking about today. And I'll go ahead and pause there. I have more I can talk about, of course, but well, let's just see how the conversation unfolds. Thank you.
So grateful for your words and your voice and your presence and your contributions. Thank you so much. We'll move now then to Amanda Lewis to share her thoughts and remarks.
Okay, hopefully I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was really great. And helped me think a little bit about what I want to focus on today. So there are lots of things to say. I want to talk in my 5 to 7 minutes about, or 7 to 10, I guess, about the work that I've been doing at the University of Illinois at Chicago as part of my role as directing the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. And I want to talk about it because it gives us a sense of some of the concrete both possibilities and challenges of doing this work in public universities, in particular today. And the Institute actually has a history in which it was created out of organizing by faculty of color and faculty doing research on race on campus who wanted more support, who wanted more space in the university. And the Institute is in many ways a core part of the university's mission, but as I'll talk about, it isn't always the case that the university remembers that or sees it that way. So at every step of the development of something like the Institute, so I'm going to talk about some of the things I think we're doing that I think are great, the Institute as a whole, not me. But I also want to foreground that every move we've made to create more space on campus has also involved struggle. So struggle, sometimes intellectual, but often political struggles around really holding up the university to live its values. So this includes the inception of the Institute, gaining permanent status through the Illinois Board of Higher Education, securing funding, securing ongoing funding, and again, it's always regular intellectual and political work. The mission of the Institute is to increase society's understandings of the root causes of racial and ethnic inequality, and to provide the public, organizers, practitioners, and policymakers with research-based policy solutions. That's a lot of gobbledygook, but I mean, some of it's substantive, but for us, policy is really a wide net. So we don't think of policy as legislation. We think of policy as anything that's shaping public conversations about what's going on in the world and what we should be doing about it. And so for us, the work is intensely about trying to make the university a more humane place, a place that embraces people doing really critical and engaged work, that recognizes that the work is hard, that there's lots of barriers to it, and that our job is in many ways to make sure people know that we value what they're doing and that they feel supported. So sometimes this means we're aligned with departments and colleges, and sometimes it means that my job is very much to go in and help intervene on people's behalfs in lots of different ways. And sometimes I feel like what we're doing is central to the institution and the university gets it. And sometimes I feel like what we're doing is very much more like a kind of fugitive space that is working around the edges and trying to do lots of things that people may or may not actually value. And some of this is about, we actually do things like provide funding for people doing engaged scholarship. So people who want to actually go out and work with community organizations. We provide support for faculty who are doing work that's hard to get supported in other places and other ways. But we also do a lot of work off campus. And to me, this is also a core part of our work about what is the university's role, not going to just be internally, like how do we make the university support and value our people, but how do we make the university responsible to the city that we're embedded in lots of different ways. And one of the ways we've been doing that, I'm sure all of you have been inundated with images nationally about Chicago these days, lots of stories about interpersonal violence and things run amok, but we all know that the history of racial dynamics in Chicago is much more complicated than that. And part of the work that we've done, for instance, is to engage in a project which we call the State of Racial Justice in Chicago, which is about capturing that full and complicated reality and really the history of structural racism in the city and in the area and how that impacts different groups today. We ask the kind of question of like Chicago for whom? and try to really shift the narrative in the city about what's going on in the city and what needs to be done about it. And we do this work with community groups. So this is the part that's hard, but essential. So over the last few years, we've worked with the American Indian Center, the American Indian Health Service of Chicago, the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Arab American Action Network. I could go on and on and on, but we've worked with community groups across the city to write these reports that are very much about what's your community experiencing right now? What do you need? How can we help? And it also is collaborating with things like, we've been working recently with Facing History and Ourselves, an educational programming group, in part because as I went out and gave dozens of presentations around the city about this work and about trying to get people to understand what's going on in Chicago differently, we realized how little people knew even about very proximate local racial history. And so part of our work has been to dig in conjunction with efforts to create a curriculum around reparations. One, about the Burge torture. I know I'm mentioning lots of things that people may want to hear more about, but we're actually working with organizations and bringing scholars like Lily Fernandez and Yvarian Baldwin in to help consult around what does it mean to create a curriculum for everybody, for the entire city of Chicago and others nationally that really grapples with our full history in the city. In kind of minute and a half I have left, I'll talk a little bit about, for me, as a white person leading this entity, one of the things that I'm constantly navigating, both, you know, I'm a faculty member in Black Studies, I'm a faculty member in Sociology, I'm directing this Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, and part of the way, core part of the way I've done this is really to try it as much as possible to kind of decenter myself and lift up the work of others. So the work that we are doing is always collaborative, very much like when we have to do public kinds of presentations or get on the news or that sort of thing, we're regularly trying to pull in a number of other scholars to do that kind of work. So for me, my job is always about how do we leverage the institution to create more space, to nurture more scholars, to make it possible for people to do the hard work that they need to do. And what's my role in trying to undo the harm that the institution has often done, both internally and externally? How do we ask hard questions about that work all the time? And as I said, about how do we make the university function in a more humane way? The chancellor in my institution always talks about us being as the university for Chicago. And the question for me always is like, if that's what we're gonna say we're doing, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? And how do we leverage the university's resources to actually make that real? And like I said, sometimes the university sees that and says, yes, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, and sometimes they don't. But it is very much about leveraging this large public institution to try to be in solidarity with communities across the city who are trying to make the city one that functions well for everybody. And I'll pause there, there's lots more to say, but thanks to Nancy very much for organizing this.
Thank you for your voice and your work and the roadmap for how to make the university accountable for anti-racism, decolonial praxis, as well as feminism. So our last speaker will give her remarks, and that's Professor Ruth Zambrana. And then we really do hope this is an interactive dialogue where we can share strategies and ideas about institutionalizing intersectionality across the university, the disciplines, and community. Ruth, you might be muted.
It told me to unmute myself. Okay. That's good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Nancy, for this opportunity for organizing this panel.
Ruth, we can't see you very well. If you want to position your camera a little bit. Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Is that better? Do more? No, that's good. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I think the question before us is really a critical question regarding intersectionality, its development and interpretation, and its inclusion and relationship to women and gender studies in what ways, particularly for Chicana women. Before I start, I just want to thank Michelle, Dr. Jacobs, for really reminding us of respect for people, for their language, and really raising the issue of symbolic gestures versus, real gestures. I think those are all critical questions right now for all of us. So thank you for that. And Amanda, I want to thank you also because you bring up, again, critical questions about what is the responsibility of the university to the surrounding community, which is a big question for us at the University of Maryland. How do we work with community groups? You kept talking about history, connection to people. Universities are connected to money now, to the global, whatever. But that's all about money. It's not about the people. And I liked, Amanda, we don't know each other. We don't know each other. And do we have a responsibility as faculty to know history, to know the people in our country? I have been an academic for a long, long time, for decades. So Nancy, it's only you and I only go 2 decades. I go way behind that. So I am the director of the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity, which was started in 1999 with Dr. Bonnie Thornton-Dill. And our goal was really to focus in on traditionally and historically underrepresented peoples who were not known in this country. So we did get in the 80s, now I'm going off my talk, but I am all in my head in my talk, Michelle, because I thought it was so important to get the points down. But from 1979 to 1983-84, we studied because we knew that we were absolute ignoramuses after we had completed our PhDs. We knew nothing about Native Americans. I didn't know a lot. I didn't know anything about African Americans, except I had had all my life informal relations with them. I knew nothing about Chicanos. I thought, I'm Puerto Rican. I thought Puerto Ricans were the only Latinos in the whole world. I mean, this is how we were never talked about it, right? So here we were, I was it, and my family and my nation. So my work has focused on traditionally and historically underrepresented peoples. And the consortium was developed, and it was mandated by our current chancellor at the time, or president, to really try to think about race, ethnicity, class, because we're in an African American hood, and we need to know about that group. And we had already studied the 4 groups, so it was a perfect consortium to try to identify Native American, African American, I define those as with a history of slavery in the US, Puerto Ricans and Mexican American, Mexican origin. And I don't consider Mexicans immigrants because we are sitting on their land, 5 states. So usually they're just coming home. So we thought this was the opportunity to bring together scholars who were interested in these different groups to really look at them intersectionally embedded in their history and in the history of this country. That was 1999, this is today. I feel like we are outdated. However, let me just go to my talk and see if how many minutes have I taken up with this? You all stimulated me already. I knew this was going to be wonderful.
You still have about 7 minutes.
Okay. So the question of institutionalizing intersectionality as a theory in the making, which I am very fortunate to be reading Patricia Hill Collins' latest book. In any curriculum of neoliberal universities raises a critical set of questions. The question itself for me provokes fears of how it will be or already has been misappropriated and used to explain the lives of colonized and racialized oppressed peoples, and by whom. In many ways, the question itself provokes a difficult conversation among us. A brief scan of the literature in major subfields of sociological inquiry, inequality, race, ethnicity, higher education, and gender and women's studies, among others, illustrates an almost cavalier use and perhaps overuse of the term intersectionality. These observations may even suggest that intersectionality has already been institutionalized in the larger canon of sociological thought and women and gender studies. Thus, the question of what are the possibilities of a midway correction, and how do we encourage a more inclusive research and pedagogy of feminisms and their unique epistemologies and genealogies, represents an important point of departure. So a deep reflection suggests multiple challenges of the use and the ways to inform the study of intersectionality, to explain how the categories of race, class, ethnicity, place, very important, Michelle, and gender are related to each other. Because it really is all about place and those colonized peoples and the lands that they were taken from and from which land was taken. So where have we fallen down on our critical theorizing? Let me offer a couple of areas for consideration. I think historical context of oppression in the United States, I'm speaking about the United States, and its impact on life course experiences has lost saliency. Or stated differently, does not frequently inform intersectional thinking. So the core tenet here is that history has been a force to close down the social and economic opportunity structure for these four groups that I'm referring to. And the difference between this and many other groups is that this closure has been consistent, persistent, and long-term, without let-up. Class is a major predictor of opportunity, and its intersection with race and ethnicity due to historical oppression and colonization has lost its centrality. There have been many critiques already of how sociology has lost class. And I ask myself, how many studies measure current class status and status of family of origin? The role of power relations, which has recently been publicly defined as structural racism, has generated all these complex, ambiguous definitions, which are more confusing than enlightening. However, I did find one finally by the Urban Institute in Washington, DC. And it's this: throughout this country's history, US, the hallmarks of American democracy, opportunity, freedom, and prosperity have been largely reserved for white people through the intentional exclusion and oppression of people of color. The deep racial and ethnic inequities that exist today are a direct result of structural racism, the historical and contemporary policies, practices, and norms that create and maintain white supremacy. That's pretty clear. We don't have to, finagle around with too many words and try to understand the code that white people use, I think. And these policies have assured the advantage of one group over another. The best example is school funding based on real estate taxes, which guarantees that working class, lower income, middle class, underrepresented folks don't have a good education. I think in the current moment, we could also take a moment to think of what are the current higher education practices that the university is currently engaged in terms of structural racism. The other point is I think American sociologists have opted for an aggregation of multiple and distinct social categories into one category: people of color, all Native Americans, women of color, Latin, Black. These categories usually have no class, no ethnicity, no citizenship status, or otherwise we talk about immigrants, which include also a whole bunch of groups. And these categories fail to acknowledge different life experiences. Class, colorism, they collapse the story into one category, which doesn't. Native Americans, it's, forgive me, Michelle, over 400 tribes. I mean, it's a lot of different people in a lot of different places with different traditions. They are not, there are differences there. So it's an ambiguous category. Now, I have been struck by this notion of POC, people of color. So I was saying without data, that probably 90% of the world is people of color. So I looked it up just so I would have some evidence today. So as it turns out, my observations are confirmed. I'm a little bit off, 1%. About 11.5% of the world's population is classified as white. So that means that almost 90% are people of color. So these collapsing constantly of issues is really important. I also looked up that in the 17th century, everyone except European whites were classified as people of color. It was again taken up by African-American women. So it seems like we have reverted back to a white supremacist meaning of POC. So what are the critiques against the use and misuse of the construct, mainly by African-American scholars? Angie Marie Hancock talks about intersectionality as a construct without borders. Everyone's using it. Jennifer Nash studies intersectionality's institutional life in US universities and women's programs and argues that the term has been rhetorically and symbolically collapsed into diversity. Done. And thus taken up as an inclusion project that resonates with the mission of the so-called corporate university. Okay, that's a good, actually it's a good place to stop. I didn't talk about Chicanas, but we'll come back to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zambrana. This is amazing. And again, the hope is that this is really a dialogue. So it's not your typical plenary. And I'll just mention a couple of questions I shared with the panelists, not because they have to answer them, but just to give you an idea of some of the topics that I was hoping we could all engage in. So one question was how ethnic studies and women's studies signal their institutional commitment to critical race and feminist intersectional inquiry and praxis. How can we sustain a robust interdisciplinary programs at the same time that we commit to transforming what counts as knowledge in sociology granting degree programs? How should we change our program names, course titles, names to signal critical race, feminist intersectionality as a fundamental pillar of these scholarly activist communities of practice? How do we create opportunities for transforming mainstream departments? How do we engage in working the cracks as insiders within, as Patricia Hill Collins has reminded us? And how do we practice critical reflexivity around our own social locations as different from our identities and ethical political commitments in a way that advances what Patricia Hill Collins refers to as flexible solidarity in her 2019 book. And then I'll end with a tiny quote where she says, critical race studies aim to resist racism, feminist studies resist heteropatriarchy, and decolonial studies resist neocolonialism. In this sense, each project reflects the particular social problems confronting Black people, women, and colonized people. Yet, each project sees beyond the particulars of that group. So with that, I wanted to open it up for questions, comments, and reflections on not only the wonderful remarks that have been shared already, but also your own praxis. What are some of the ways that you are working towards this transformation? And you feel free to use the chat or voice your question.
I could jump in with a quick comment. So I've been going back. We're talking a little bit. Oh, camera doesn't really work. I'm trying to show off my beautiful second edition of Bridge Calling My Back.
We can see glimpses. We can see part of it. Yeah.
All right. And so something I've really been reflecting on is one of Audre Lorde's quotes here. I'll just share it quickly. For women, the need and desire to nurture each other is not pathological, but redemptive. And it is within that knowledge that our real power is discovered. And so I think for me, you know, in thinking about these, for me are like, those are really hefty questions, Nancy. And I think what I struggle with is so often in our analyses and, you know, in my home discipline of sociology, it's because I work in a college of education now. But I see this recentering of the institution. And in a lot of ways, it's like recentering white supremacy so that we're always acting back against it. or reacting back against it. And it's like, it's so hard because that it forecloses our opportunities to connect and to dream and to nurture ourselves, each other, our students. And so I'm really interested in questions and ideas about what do we want, you know, like what our hearts, our dreams, like what's really in them. And you know, I appreciated comments of my fellow panelists. And, you know, Ruth, you mentioned getting your PhD and not knowing anything. I forget how you said it, but it was something similar to that. And it's like, yeah, when are we going to transform graduate education, undergraduate education, so that our institutions and our programs and our courses are about shifting to center the dreams of our students, so that we become what I call them, a story I wrote about academic aunties as being partners in our students' dreams. And so that's what I'm interested in. And so I'll give just a concrete example, since we're kind of strategizing here, is that I'm the director of our Subsequentla program, which that's Sahaptin Indigenous language for teacher. It's an American Indian Alaska Native teacher training program. We're highly successful. We have a lot of federal grant funding. We have altogether in the program's history 96 alumni, and this is master's level, where students get their master's degree and their teaching license now in 12 months. So it's a tough program, but we have a 99% graduation rate. So I'll say that again, it's a graduate program, 99% graduation rate, a graduate program that serves Indigenous students. And sure, you know, my university likes to pick that up and say like, oh, what a great program. And yeah, it is. Yet, you know, we're also just good at centering the dreams of our students, getting out of their way, understanding that they have all the potential and strengths needed to succeed, each and every one of them. And this, the inherent brilliance in our communities, you know? And so how do we structure our universities so more of that happens? And I see a lot of that love and care and concern and planning in the work that Amanda mentioned, right? So one way that we do that, and I'll just quickly wrap up so other folks can join in, is, you know, we say we want to be partners with the 9 federally recognized tribes in the state of Oregon. And that's one way to decolonize the university, right? Is to be in respectful partnership with the peoples on whose land we're on, our institution is on. And so, yeah, you can do MOUs and you can have kind of symbolic gestures and even meetings where you give updates and so forth. But we actually dig in and we share that power so that we're operated as a consortium where the tribal councils of all 9 tribes designate a rep to our tribal advisory council. And yes, we meet quarterly and we make all important decisions for our program through consensus with our tribal advisory council, including admissions, including funding decisions. And so that's just an example, you know, like when we say we want to do things differently, it means we have to do things differently. So that's, I'll stop there so other folks can chime in.
Thank you so much for sharing. That is inspirational. And it really, I love and appreciate the idea that we need to decenter the institution in doing this work. Anyone else wants to share, either from the audience or the panel, on any of these questions or issues or other ideas that you want to bring forth?
You know, I think for me, a lot of this and what Michelle's talking about, the student, centering the student, there are very few faculty who have values that you're talking about, Michelle, or that have values and who have the knowledge of the groups. And I've been really thinking about that as I write about mentoring. It's hard to mentor if you don't know the life course, if you don't know the life, if you don't know the place, if you don't know the values of that student, because then you just mentor like blanket. And we don't know if that puzzle piece is going to fit in the puzzle. So I do think this is a moment. I already sent my president 10 anti-institutional actions that he could take. I don't know where that's going, but place matters here. So places like University of Maryland, who think they're #1 public institution, or some of the Ivy Leagues, place matters. But I think we do have to start with letting faculty know that they need to learn history, that they need to know that there are 574 tribes. And I apologize for my ignorance. I always try to keep on top of things, but it's hard. That there are 574 tribes, that they value their land, that when you have, you know, that African-American students with a history of slavery are very different from Afro-Caribbean students, from African students. And I've worked with the 3 of them and they are all different. The same thing with Latinos, you know, the Argentinian, European background is not the same as a Mexican student from a farm worker family in Oregon and California, etc. So where do we start with faculty? I think that's really important. The other thing we have to really think about is issues of equity. And equity is about giving those who don't have the push or the lift so that they could be equal. So we could have an equal start. We cannot have an equal start without equity. And for many historically underrepresented, we don't have equality, and no one's giving us equity. And I think the other thing we really have to think and reflect clearly on, this country is just such a racist country that I hear vulnerabilities, at risk, disadvantage. I mean, we all have a level of oppression. We are all oppressed in some way. So how do we begin to identify what is called now in the public health field, priority groups, who really are disadvantaged, who need the equity lift? So I think these are critical questions that we as a country find it very hard to engage, because we believe there is equality, and that myth must be challenged.
Thank you so much. And I see that there was a post from our incoming president for the Sociologists for Women in Society, Professor Mignon Moore. If she doesn't mind sharing that, I think we should probably make that known.
Oh, I can, I mean, I have background noise in my house, but I was just saying that I've been so impressed with the ways that students the students that I've been seeing have not accepted the status quo, things that I just took for granted about white supremacist structures never changing. They're saying, no, this needs to change. The core needs to change. I mean, when I went to my college, I would criticize the core, but I just never imagined that I or any group of oppressed people would have the power to even suggest such a thing. If these students are so serious in ways that I just find, I think that I'm progressive, but then when I look at them, they are unrelenting in this quest, and I feel encouraged by that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Nancy, I just want to add, I was looking at Mignon's comments, and I think she's exactly right. And that, like, one of the things that's been true even in my institution, in my department, is the students are constantly pushing the boundaries in ways that make us all, including myself, feel uncomfortable. We're just like, wait a minute, that's not how we do. And then it's like, well, why do we do things that way? So there's so many levels, both thinking about everything from the university police force, everything from how we organize preliminary exams, everything from, like at every level, I think partly inspired by a lot of them are also engaged in activism outside of university. And I think we're in a moment right now where people are really, Bill Ayers years ago, talked about demanding the impossible. Like, how do we begin to really ask for not what we think we can get, but what we really think So I think looking to the students, both the graduate students, the undergrad, for kind of listening carefully. I mean, it's been a major push. I think this gets to answer your question about changing the departments themselves, like changing sociology as a discipline and field, is how do we get people to embrace, and this is true anytime we do this kind of justice work, how do we embrace feeling uncomfortable, right? How do we embrace the fact that things that we thought, or we kind of took for granted, as Myon said, are like really, really worth questioning in key ways. So that's part of it. I think really embracing that, as much as it's difficult, is important, and paying attention to where the really smart vision insight is coming from is really important. And I also think creating space of nurturing is super important. I mean, one of the things that sustains people, it keeps them engaged, keeps them not feeling completely alienated, is sometimes the small. I mean, we found we run these writing retreats in the summer for graduate students and faculty, and obviously it's impossible to do right now, but feeding people and providing small things that say, the work you're doing, we recognize how hard the intellectual and actual work you're doing is, and we want to help. Just creating communities of care, I think, is often really counter to thinking about how universities are supposed to work. But it also creates space for people who might otherwise hesitate to really come forward with thoughts and ideas about how to do things differently. So those are just a couple thoughts.
Wonderful. So there's a comment from Bandana, if you wanted to share it. And I think it was for you, Amanda.
Okay, I'll unmute myself. So I just want to preface the question I asked Amanda by saying that I actually happen to belong to a university that on paper, and I emphasize on paper, kind of looks good, because from 1999 and earlier, we've had African American Studies Institute, at that time, Puerto Rican and Latino Studies Institute. We've had American Studies Institute, with which I have a joint appointment. We even for a while had a provost and a school structure where and of course the Women's Studies, it's called program. And for a while we had the provost structure where we've all brought together, and in some ways reflect some of the issues that Amanda is saying. But honestly, over the years, the university has tied us up into doing all kinds of picayune bureaucratic things. So on paper we look good, but in reality, we are no longer doing the kind of stuff that Amanda, I've admired your university for doing. And that's why I asked that question about, like, what are some of these worst challenges you feel that universities bring to us, and how do you keep the energy to keep going? Mm-hmm. Like literally, decades and decades later, how do you find your energy to keep going? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'll offer a few ideas, and I'm sure there are lots of other brilliant people in this conversation who can add. So one of the things I think for me is choosing to work into a place where we have a critical mass of people doing intersectional, critical race studies in different ways in different places. I've been at other institutions. I thought about moving to other institutions that I think in kind of status hierarchies people might think of as more prestigious or whatever. And it became clear to me at some point that what mattered most for my own sustaining energies was the people that I was, more than like the buildings or the libraries or that sort of thing. Nice buildings are nice, but so that's one thing. But I think there are costs. I mean, I'm in an underfunded public institution. I will say, though, that I'm regularly surprised by how much we're able to do, with not a huge number of resources. And part of it is about, you know, being strategic about the kind of political struggles that we're in. I'm also, I have to admit, like really building on brilliant legacy. I'm the third permanent director. Phil Bowman, who was the first one, he navigated brilliantly some of the political challenges that I think we'd have to be, I'd have to have a glass of my wine in my hand to really kind of talk. And then Beth Ritchie was the next director and really leveraged her immense intellectual and strategic brilliance on how to make the work feel essential to the institution. That doesn't mean it's not constantly on.
We lost your audio, Amanda. I'm not sure why.
No, we can't hear you.
Can't hear you. There might be a call-in number, or I could always place you on a speaker on my mobile. But
I'll
you're
call
back.
in, but you can move on to somebody else.
You're back if you wanted to finish.
Okay, that's so weird. I don't know. I was just saying, like, this work is only possible because I mean, it is a lot of work to constantly be in community with folks around the city and around campus. And that work is completely necessary. Like, whenever I think the administration of my university is trying to figure out whether to cut our budget or what, you know, a reference, you know, from folks on their different, you know, the African American Advisory Committee or the Latino Advisory Committee. You know, there's people around the city who we're constantly in conversation with, who circle around and tell the university that they appreciate, you know, so there's a lot of that kind of thinking strategically. And that part is exhausting, which is why I'm on leave right now for a long time. So I'm taking a year off, but it is super important. And it's also the stuff that is sustaining. Anyway, I want to hear what other people have to say, so I'll stop talking.
We still have about 15 minutes left, but I did want to read a comment from Roberta Villalon, who is not able to speak it, and then we'll have Ruth make some comments that she's put in the chat. So Roberta says, I also think it's important to decenter the United States when taking a global South perspective, learn the histories of these countries, understanding their colonial past, and own intersectional inequalities to avoid homogenizing their experiences. In turn, this is critical to our relationships with migrants and our understanding of migration processes and flows. So that is such an important contribution to this dialogue. I think absolutely that's probably part of the reason why I majored in Latin American studies and not sociology as an undergrad. And that really did provide me a very different perspective in terms of understanding what's happening here. So thank you for that comment. Ruth, you were gonna also jump in.
I was going to say, well, that comment creates a tension also, because I think that at least my faculty, the women's studies, they know a lot more about South Asia than they know about the United States and Chicanas, about Dominicans, about any of us. So how do we get faculty to know who their students are? And most of the students are going to be African Americans, so it doesn't help African Americans and Mexican Americans, who represent 65% of the total Latino population group, if we know history. So how do we balance this? And no one knows anything about Native Americans in this country. Nobody. So again, these create additional tensions, I think, among groups without acknowledging the tremendous racism that existed. But that was just, again, there are many touch points that I have sensitivities, because when you look at the history of these four groups, the chronic and unrelenting inequality and inequity is just heartbreaking. But I was going to speak to Amanda's point when we talk about, and I forgot, Mignon's point. So I heard a webinar which I thought was fascinating of how do we work with students. And what I liked, there were three ways of working with students. The one I liked was the one that talked about power sharing. So I want to give an example. So we work with students because their demands are usually to break down the system to do all of that, and that's not going to happen. So how do we help them and us, even if we feel uncomfortable, to define a point of change that we can assure will benefit the students, and hopefully us, because if they are benefited, that gives us more freedom to take care of them, to provide communities of care. And I want to give an example of Maryland. So the students have a demand that we break all relations with the corrections program that the University of Maryland has, because we do use their desk and we buy their desks, etc. So the student says we have to break that relationship. My first thinking was, no, don't break that relationship. Let's make sure they pay them more, that they pay them $10 an hour or $12 an hour, that they put aside $10 a week or whatever is left over for their families, for when they leave, that they have an asset. So again, how do we work together with students to provide different alternatives? And then the president went ahead and there was a study done, a focus group of the men, and they love the program. It gives them a sense of mastery, it gives them skills. So again, as we work with students, we want to look at change. That's external change, which I think to change the criminal justice system and how they pay those individuals and how we can support them and their families and develop some assets would be a really powerful structural change, rather than saying we don't want to talk to you anymore. So again, it just raises this issue of power between students and faculty, how faculty can use their power. So in one situation, they said, you can't go into the Senate and be as effective as we can. So let us go in, tell us what you want, we'll do that. We can't be as effective as you can be to march up and down and scream in front of the whatever. So again, as we look at this, Amanda, for the rest of the group, I think students can be a powerful source, but they also need guidance, and we don't want to steal their show, and we want to use our power to help them, but it has to be a collaboration, and it could be both at the university level and social justice structural change. So I just want to share that with you because we've been doing a lot of thinking about that.
And that really echoes what Michelle shared with us earlier about centering students. They have a lot of solutions. And I did notice that Barbara Sutton put a comment that I wanted her to speak, but before I let Barbara speak, I also want to remind everyone about the urgency of the 2020 census. And I think you all know that the deadline was moved up a month, and we know that this is part of something that's been under construction for a long time to continue underrepresenting communities that are marginalized. So if you can mobilize, also join those efforts with voter registration and absentee balloting requests, because this is a critical moment. And we know that the census is going to shape so much, as well as what happens in November. So I want to give the opportunity to Barbara Sutton to share her thoughts.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you. It was more like a question and a plea, I guess, if we can perhaps also think about some strategies and talk a little bit about the current social and political and public health context when it is, so evident that these conversations and this work is so important, but at the same time, the universities are explicitly or implicitly threatening to cut the very programs or the people, who are doing that work at the same time that they are also some superficial gesturing to address the issues. But when it comes to where the resources go, what we see is an opposite movement. And I mean, I have been following the news about what's happening in various institutions, and frankly, it is very concerning.
I love that question, Barbara, because it reminds me of one of the principles of interest convergence in critical race theory that says if we can make small gains when we align our interests with that of the university, at the same time that I'm deeply aware of not recentering the university, right? But this is such an important question. I wanted to know if anyone wanted to jump in and share their thoughts. I don't know if Michelle wanted to, any of the panelists.
Sure, I'll jump in really quickly. Thank you so much. It's so important, and I agree with Nancy's comment that she just shared as well. And I think is part of our dreaming, right? That's kind of a key message I'm sharing today, is that we also have to acknowledge the power that we have. So those of us, especially who are tenured, those of us who are senior, those of us who have grant funding, those of us who bring so much to the table with regard to strong relationships and collaborations with communities who our universities say they're serving, like that's all leverage. And we need to use that when, when there are questions of resource allocation on the line. And so that's something that I have to do almost consistently at the University of Oregon. They don't just sit back and, give us everything we need so that we can be successful. But it's about, having that courage to believe in those dreams that we share with our students and with our communities, and to be honest with the administration, right? When they say, nope, there's hiring freeze, like they told me this spring, university-wide hiring freeze, those 2 positions that your program's supposed to have, it's not gonna happen. I said, okay, well, this program, university promised those positions as part of our grant proposal that was funded. So, we can give the $1.25 million back. And you know what, since you know better than me, you can run the program. That's fine. And so just having that courage, and, it's, I think there is a humility there that, we have planned these programs, we've built these relationships with that humility that community knows best, students know best, right? And that we're there to do that important leadership work, and to have that courage that we can trust in that dream. I don't know, so those are my ideas for now. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that strategy. I love it. I know that others might want to comment on that particular concern. And there is one more comment from Marisela. We still have about 7 minutes remaining. If Marisela would like to speak her comment, I think we can.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Hi. I think one of the things that can happen that I've noticed in working with students is that there's a fear for this come back for you later politics, which is really, sort of rampant in the history of of movements when they've tried to be collaborative. It's this idea that we'll take care of this now, today, and then we'll come back for you later. And so students worry about being erased or overlooked. And so I think that one of the things Roberta wrote in the chat was, it's the idea of coming to the table with much more humility, and there's a trust factor involved in this kind of work as well. And it demonstrates that we're doing the work. When I came out here to Utah, a lot of the research and articles that I would use in my class regarding Asian Americans had a lot to do with East Asian Americans or South Asian Americans. Where here, the larger population is Pacific Islander students, and then there's a whole discussion about whether or not they're Indigenous, and and so I went and had to do the work to go find out some really great information about it. But having a student be able to come in your class and see themselves on your on your syllabus is really very rewarding. But I think that's what it is this idea that, wow, you see me, you understand me. I think that's at the heart of it.
Thank you, Marisela. I don't know if people are wanting to make last departing comments. We still have 5 minutes left, but I wanted to make sure that the panelists had an opportunity to share any last remark or thought that occurs to you. And if time permits, we could probably entertain another question.
Nancy, I'd say one thing, which is that I don't want to minimize how hard this is. And I was talking about the work we're doing at the Institute, and I also mentioned I'm in Department of Black Studies at UIC, which is an amazing colleagues, whatever, and we are always fighting with the institution. Again, you know, with the funding model that most of these institutions have gone to, which is totally tuition driven and about numbers of majors, and there's just a constant fight to make it clear why we are central to the university's mission. And those, you know, so we're always going to be working on this on multiple fronts. And that's, again, and partly why it's so important that we're constantly collaborating with gender women studies, Latin American Latino studies, and global Asian studies, and talking to each other. But it's a lot, you know, and I want to be both kind of.
Your voice disappeared again. I'm not sure why again.
Okay. Well, Nancy, I can comment while we get Amanda back.
Sure, go for it. We'll have Ruth comment now.
I think this is a very political conversation. And I say political, I mean in terms of power relations, even among institutional actors, leaders, and faculty. So when we talk about inclusion, exclusion, we start out with intersectionality and who's included and excluded. One of the things I had talked about was that in women and gender studies, oftentimes the voice of Mexican American, Chicana women, and other Latino subgroups is missing. I know nothing is taught about Puerto Ricans, or very little at Maryland on the East Coast even, or Dominicans, and even though we are on the East Coast. So I think what is taught is important. It speaks, and who was it? Martinez. You know, when you walk into the classroom, if you're Pacific Islander, yes, you would like someone or your instructor to know something about this. So I don't want to move away. The faculty are the institution. The faculty support the institution. The faculty need to have the courage, as Michelle just said, to say, hey, that's not good enough. And, you know, I had a white male stand up one day at a meeting because this woman, actually, she has an important place in the university, dismissed me and didn't want to hear about African-American students or historically underrepresented students. And he stood up and he said, yes, she has something important to say and you have to listen. First time in my life, it was a wonderful feeling actually for a white male to have the courage to say to a white woman, hey, you know, don't do that. So as we talk about institutions, I want us to also be very cognizant that faculty make up those institutions. And that faculty, contrary to popular thought, are conservative, not radical. So each and every one of us in this group, Amanda and Michelle, we're up against institution, but that the tentacles of that institution are the faculty. And how do we, in order to change the institution, we also have to change the faculty. In order to, you know, extend the thinking of women and gender studies for them to be more inclusive. And, you know, some of the other critiques was intersectionality has been depoliticized, intersectionality has really been whitewashed, has been mainstreamed. All those critiques are faculty. So I just want us to remember this because we're sort of getting away from the crux of the matter when we keep talking about the institution only. There are layers here that keep that institution the way it is. So I just want us to think about that.
And that reminded me of one of the strategies we've used here at the University of New Mexico through the Diversity Council, which is to institute a preferred criteria that says demonstrated commitment to equity and inclusion for all hires, not only faculty, but staff as well. Now the devil's in the details. How is that being implemented? Is it actually a cosmetic use or is it an authentic use of that? And is it, why should it be a preferred criteria, not a minimum? Michelle, did you want to share any departing thoughts? And I cannot thank this panel enough, but I want to make sure in these this second that remains.
Yeah,
Or minutes.
just real quickly, I just want to thank everybody for being here. You know, I respect and honor each person who took the time to attend. I'm willing to bet that you do so much for our students, for our communities, to work for radical changes, you know, that are going to create the kind of world that we really want to see and that we really want to be a part of. So I thank you. And I would conclude with just sharing that I think it's important that we take care of ourselves and each other so we can do this work for the long haul, you know, so that we don't burn out, so that we don't get sick, you know, that we see so many of our dear colleagues struggle with that. And so part of that is saying no. You know, we know when we're getting some BS request from our institutions, do this diversity committee, sit on that committee, oh, your voice is so important, your perspective is so important. We know when they're actually gonna back our vision and when they just want us there as a tokenizing presence. And so just cut loose those tokenizing presence, you know, and if you're feeling isolated, you know, there's gotta be somebody senior there who's gonna support you in those decisions. And so, you know, those of us who are senior, we can help to make that pathway bigger, you know, for freeing up students and untenured faculty, for instructors to be able to do those refusals. So for example, one last strategy I'll share. In my annual review, we have to do annual reviews every year. In my document this year, I wrote, you know, here's my vision. University's not, you know, we're doing some good stuff, but it's not even close. I am fiercely dedicated to this vision. And that means I'm going to say no to every request that doesn't directly align with it. And, you know, my department head, they raised their eyebrows at it. And I said, yep, you know, this is why I'm here. You shouldn't have hired me if you didn't want this, you know? And so I think, you know, there's so much that we can do. And I don't know, I just, I feel hopeful despite all the crap we see everywhere. I feel hopeful, you know, it's that radical hope that keeps us going, that brought us here today. So I thank you so much.
I can't think of a better way to end this conversation, but actually continue it, because just this last comment from Esther is beautiful. I'm going to just read it. Thank you for these amazing presentations and comments and for the resources shared. I just copied them for my classes this semester. So these conversations are going to continue. This is only the beginning of a long, long journey. And I am so grateful to each of you. I admire and love each of you, everyone on this call. And I cannot thank Barrett and Natasha and Josephine Beoku-Betts and this family that I found in SWS for creating this space, for sharing, for healing, and for cultivating solidarity. So with that, I will end by thanking everyone who joined and our amazing panelists, and looking forward to our continued connections and work together in the years ahead. Mil gracias, familia.